Within You Season 4, in the opening episode, we saw that Joe was introduced to all of the elites that became some of the main parts of the story that was unfolding throughout the span of the 10 episodes in Season 4. Within Episode 2 of the show, we heard Phoebe say to Joe that what he said to her changed her, and mentioned how she didn't know if she'd ever been seen so clearly by anybody, and that something out there brought them together to be friends. However, we never found out what it was that he said to her on that night, as the season ended without concluding it. But I thought I'd theorize about what could have been spoken between the pair, and paint the most likely option as to what it was that he said and why we most likely never got the concrete answer from the show. So let's get into it. Here is what did Joe say to Phoebe in You Season 4. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. Lady Phoebe was one of the main supporting characters throughout Season 4 of You, and she made a name for herself for being the one that most probably wasn't with it the most, and she was exploited by her boyfriend and fiancé at the time, Adam. She was viewed by everybody else as the person that they saw in the articles that were written about her and how the press portrayed her. However, we saw that at the end of the season, she wasn't actually like everybody else in the group, and she actually wanted to do good with her life and help others around her, as we saw when she went off to Thailand to teach English to the children. Within the first episode, when Joe was being introduced to everybody that Kate was friends with at the club, Lady Phoebe was one of the first people that he spoke to. But this wasn't the conversation that we're wanting to find out information from. As we heard what was said here, this discussion was about how he ended up in London, if he had his heart broken, and if he actually went on to kill somebody. So we know that a nerve was touched when that was spoken. However, it was later on down the line in this episode where we saw the conversation that was never spoke of again throughout the entirety of the show. We saw that Joe was in a flow of drinking and communicating with everybody that was in the bar, from Sophie to Malcolm and then Phoebe. A Phoebe that was in tears and being cradled by Kate once Joe realized that he was even speaking to her. What's even more baffling about this is the fact that she looked deeply upset in that moment and like he'd said something that hurt her feelings, rather than something that allowed her to be seen like nobody had ever viewed her before. However, it must have been done at that moment, as that's what she's referring to. Phoebe said this to Joe in the second episode of the show when he went round to her apartment, and she was impressed by what he said to her the night before. A drastically different mood and reaction and sense of emotions to the last time that we saw her in the club. So what do I think was spoken? Well, I think there are a couple of different things that could have been said. The first is one that I think is quite out there in terms of possibility, but I think it could be about Phoebe being stalked throughout her own life. We saw that when we were first learning about Phoebe in the opening episode, there was a quick succession of news articles from all throughout her life that were flashing on screen. One was focused around her having another stalker, something that it seems as though she's had throughout the entirety of her life in the public eye. Something that Joe does before he meets somebody is does his research, so this could well have been something that he leaned in on. This could be a reason as to why she felt that Joe saw her in a way that nobody else had seen her before, because as we know, Joe is a serial stalker and knows what it's like to communicate with somebody that's been locked up and stalked by himself. So when she was speaking about her concerns and the threats that she may often face, he could have known how best to respond to her, leaning in on the love interests that he had stalked in the past, Marion, Love, and even Beck, which in turn would have allowed her to let him in, and also meant that she felt as though they were destined to come together as friends, as she said in the second episode when they met again. This is definitely something that I think is plausible, and it could also explain why she was upset when we saw the scene unraveling, because it would have meant that she would have gone to darker parts of her own mind. Another option of something that they could have spoken about is that they could have spoken about his feelings towards Marion. Prior to the conversation happening, we saw that Joe was talking to Malcolm about Marion, and explaining that he was in London because he followed a woman to Paris and then she broke his heart. He went on to speak about how they were perfect together, and he was getting quite passionate when talking about it. So there's nothing to say that Joe couldn't have continued this conversation with Phoebe, especially due to the fact that Malcolm said everybody thought he was there because of love. So it showed that Joe was clearly a talking point, especially the sudden appearance. The infatuated love that Joe would have been expressing about Marion when talking to Phoebe is something that she may have related to herself and Adam at the time, and she could have been in awe at the lengths that Joe was prepared to go to in order to be with somebody that he loved, something that maybe she didn't see with Adam at the time, hence the reason as to why she was crying when we saw her last. Joe could have spoken a few home truths about Adam and Phoebe's relationship, and it may have caused her to get upset. While there's not a lot of evidence to suggest this, the flow of conversation before could well have been leading to that. So what do I believe was actually spoken at this moment? Well, personally, I'm leaning more towards the first option of Joe being able to strike up a relationship with Phoebe due to her past experience of being stalked. This is something that nobody else in the group would be able to understand, but Joe would be able to, especially the fact that he could flip it and understand a victim's mentality due to being the person that was the attacker. So it's a twisted conversation that we never got to see that would have most likely painted Joe as the evil individual and given us more of a deeper insight into his twisted mind far sooner than when we saw him framing Nadia for the murder of Edward later on in the Season 4 Part 2 finale. So why do I think it wasn't answered at all in the show, and more specifically in Season 4 Part 2? I think it was for a stylistic reason. I don't think it was done as a plot hole. I think it was done for two different reasons. To show that one, Joe can be a good person and be there for people when they need him, and he doesn't even necessarily realize. This could have been his Paco or Ellie moment in Season 4, albeit if it's clouded over slightly. And I think it was also done like this because it leaned in on the fact that when people have consumed a lot of drink, they tend to let their inhibitions get the better of them, and they speak about things that they often forget about by the next morning. But one person can often go deeper than the other, so I imagine it was a stylistic choice to make it one of those things that happens when people speak about something deep and then never remember it or acknowledge it again. It's a shame that it will most likely never be answered, especially with Joe going off to New York and moving away from that previous life. However, with Joe still being with Kate, we could potentially see it dropped into conversation in Season 5 if it proves to be relevant, as Kate was actually there comforting Phoebe when the conversation was taking place. So there is a small bit of hope for us for finding out what was said one day. So, there you have it, what Joe said to Phoebe in You Season 4. If you want to see more videos such as endings explained, theories and predictions, and character breakdowns, then click on the I button. Or alternatively, you can head over to my channel where you'll find them all. If you'd like to give me a show or movie that you'd like me to review, then head over to my Twitter, @brainpilot_, and tweet me what show or movie you'd like me to review next. And finally, if you'd like to see what I rate the latest movies that don't quite make the cut to getting a dedicated video, then head over to my Letterboxd profile. It's where I rate the latest releases in real time. What do you think he said to Lady Phoebe? Leave a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.